Good morning and good afternoon. Isn't it nice to be back in an ICIS conference, even if we still have to be virtual this time? Hopefully next time we can be face-to-face, exchanging ideas and information in the usual way. What I want to do today to kick off the conference is to look at what's happened over the last 18 months, obviously look forward a bit to COP26 in a couple of months' time, and look ahead to 2022 as we start to do budgets. What are the challenges and the opportunities? And I'm going to argue that business as usual is really not on the table now, that so many changes have taken place that the business that's going to emerge post-pandemic and as we move into a net zero phase, or attempting to get net zero, is going to change radically the business, which will create a number of major new opportunities, but also challenges. You can see the changes taking place, the paradigm shifts in terms of demand patterns. I don't think we'll ever go back to working happily in offices as we did in the past. Reshoring supply chains. I ran chlorine, caustic soda, PVC, petrochemicals and plastics businesses. I helped to build all these global supply chains, but they've clearly proved fragile and very unfit for purpose over the last 18 months, and we're not going to continue with those. We're also going to see a decline, I think, because of net zero in the use of fossil fuels, and we're going to move to an era, therefore, of energy abundance. The fact really being that if you're going to move to wind and solar, you have to have a lot of storage for the days when wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. But of course, when the wind does blow and the sun does shine, which is most days in most countries, then you're going to have virtually free electricity. And I can say, if you run a chlor-alkali business, then free electricity would be very good news indeed, and for other business in the plastics area. So this is a challenge because it creates stranded assets for us, but it also creates a major opportunity for us. Then, of course, if we're going to reshore and we're going to have energy abundance, then we're moving towards a circular economy, which we need to do because of the plastic waste problem, of course. So that creates another opportunity for us. And finally, of course, we're going to be doing it with advanced manufacturing, greener, safer, cheaper and faster technology than we've had in the past, because there's no point in reshoring and trying to build a circular economy with the technology of the past. We want to be using the technology of the future. So if I was to sum it up in one picture, what I'd be saying is that essentially, if you go back to 1967, Mr. Maguire talking to Dustin Hoffman was absolutely right when he said, "Go into plastics, young man." And what Mr. Maguire would say today, if they were remaking The Graduate, I'm sure would be go into recycled plastics. Because we've had decades of successful growth with plastics. We don't want to get rid of plastics at all because their CO2 emissions are much lower than glass or metal or cardboard or anything else. But we've got to move to renewable carbon. And plastics, therefore, are going to be a vital tool for us in that area. So what I want to do is to look at supply chain chaos that we've borne, at the key challenges that we're coming up with today and the opportunities, and then start to put some ideas across about who are going to be the winners and losers. How do we become winners and losers? And so just to start with my friend Kevin Swift, who's now just retired this month as chief economist of the American Chemistry Council, has done 31 years of wonderful service for us in providing all the data that we rely on. As you can see, his last chart here shows that in July, capacity utilization was back near record levels. And we know that that therefore that we haven't seen a production-led problem in most industries. We have in the auto industry because they cancelled all their orders for chips. Well, if you cancel your orders, you can't expect supply to restart immediately. That's their problem. But in the chemical industry, we have kept supplies going very well indeed, not only for pandemic-related products, but also, which have been vital, but also for all the other products as well. But what we've also seen is buyers quite understandably putting in extra orders, as the chart from financial firm GLG shows, who interviewed 70 purchasing professionals around in petrochemicals and plastics. And on balance, apparent demand increased because inventories increased. And this always happens if you get shortages emerging through supply chain or because oil prices move up, people order a bit more because they say, well, it's going to be more expensive next month, and I might not be able to get hold of it. At some point, those inventories will get unwound, probably not immediately, but we are seeing apparent demand rising. Real demand is somewhat lower, I'm afraid to say. And I think real demand will continue to be relatively weak for a couple of reasons, really. One is that we haven't got universal vaccination. We've got some countries that are moving up, full vaccination of adults and indeed children. But some countries just can't afford the vaccines and can't get hold of them, which is tragic. Some countries are prey to malicious news, masquerading as news about vaccination and so on, which means that innocent people are dying and becoming ill because they aren't being vaccinated. And that's a terrible tragedy as well. But of course, what that also does is that creates further complications in the supply chain, because you also get governments doing different policies. So a lot of governments in Asia, for example, have tried to go for a zero COVID position, where they've closed their borders effectively and said you can't come in, you can't go out, we're going to keep COVID out. Of course, what that means is their population doesn't get vaccinated, because they say, well, why do I need to get vaccinated? I don't need to. We've got no COVID here. Well, what that means is when somebody does get in, because they have to get supplies in, they have to sell goods to earn their way in the world and so on, COVID gets in, then you're getting shutdowns for 5-10 days in big cities and in ports, and you're seeing this on a continuous but random basis, which means you can't plan for it. You can see the number of port restrictions that are in place at the moment, and you can see the effect there on the chart from the Financial Times on shipping delays, where ships are just not arriving as reliably as they were, and there's no great sense that that's going to change very quickly. So we're seeing these supply chain problems emerging here. So where does that take us then in terms of challenges and opportunities if we look forward to the end of the year, we look forward budget for next year, as these paradigm shifts move forward? So what we're seeing is 5 major paradigm shifts, I think. And we talk about these in our challenge workshops that we do with companies. What's the effect of these paradigm shifts on your business? It's something that's absolutely critical for businesses to understand and get to grips with. So changes in demand patterns, reshoring of supply chains, energy abundance, move towards the circular economy, and the opportunities from advanced manufacturing. All of these are coming together. In the past, we would tend to work down a silo and we say, look, I'm supplying the auto industry, so I really need to focus on the auto industry. I don't need to bother about the rest. That's all going to be happening at the same time. But today, that's not true. We've actually got to take a view across the wider landscape, because if we're moving towards the end of fossil fuels, and the International Energy Agency, the world's watchdog on this, is saying that's where we're going, well, we won't have refineries. If we don't have refineries, then we won't have naphtha for our plastics production. Similarly, we don't have fossil fuel investment because we're moving to renewables, we won't have ethane. So these changes in the landscape are having a major effect. And of course, we've seen that with the shipping delays and everything else, things we used to take for granted. I think the greatest oil minister of my time, certainly, was Sheikh Yamani of Saudi Arabia. And Sheikh Yamani, back in 2000, made a prediction where he said, if we look forward 30 years, there will be a huge amount of oil and no buyers. 30 years from now, there is no problem with oil. The Stone Age did not end because we ran out of oil, and the Oil Age will not end because we run out of oil. I think that's absolutely right. And his timing, I think, is going to be spot on, that by 2030, we won't be using oil in the same way. And if we're not using oil, then we won't have it available for plastics and PET production. Similarly, one of the things we know very clearly is that demographics is destiny. And we had a lot of baby boomers, obviously, after the Second World War. And for a long time, they created constant growth. Because once you got into the wealth creator 25 to 54 age group, well, you're settling down, you're maybe having babies, you're moving along in your career and so on, your income is going up. So you're getting constant growth. But if you look now to the next, out to 2030, in the States, in Europe, in China, in the world, the majority of population growth is in the perennials, the over 55s. Perennials, very nice people like myself. But one of the characteristics is they already own most of what they need, and as people retire, so their incomes tend to go down. And so you can see that in the States. If you compare 2000 and 2020 data from the government, what you see is there's only been a very small increase in the number of households in the wealth creator area. There's been a massive increase in the number of perennials. This is really because of vaccinations and better healthcare and so on. People are living much longer, which is very good news indeed, obviously, particularly if you're a perennial. And 23 million more perennial households in 2020 than there were in 2000. Phenomenal increase. But in terms of spending, the perennial household actually spends around $12,000 less. And that is a slight exaggeration in itself, because obviously when you move from being 55 to 56, you don't suddenly reduce all your spending. But if you look over the period, you look between 55 and 75, your spending goes down by around 44%. So as the baby boomers get more and more into the perennials era, and as they get older and become older perennials, so you're going to see that spending difference increase, which just says we have to think differently about where growth is going to come from in the future. Now, one of the things about a very successful business like ours is that if we think about what we do, we tend to say, well, business as usual, we know that that's more or less how it's been. Yeah, we get bumps in the road and so on, but, it all stays the same. But in fact, we know in life, things don't stay the same. There's photos from New York in 1900 and 1930 highlight this. Really, developments take place on an S-curve. So you go along for a while, you're not quite sure what it is you're trying to do. The customer isn't quite sure what you're trying to get produced for them, what's the benefit and so on. You see this in smartphones, you see this in computers, you see this in all sorts of things in our lives. And it's the same here. In 1900, if you look very carefully on Fifth Avenue, you can see one car. 13 years later, the S-curve has kicked in. Suddenly people realize, oh, that's what he could do for me. That would be fantastic. And so suddenly, if you look there at 1913, you can hardly see one horse, more than one horse. See? So these changes, once they happen, take place very quickly. And one has to remember that in 1900, people were very, very worried about the manure crisis, that they saw all these horses and more horses coming in as cities developed. And where would all the manure go? People were writing articles and worrying about manure levels rising to the first floor of apartment blocks. Well, it didn't happen because the car came along instead. And that's a measure of the speed and power of these transitions. And the European Commission has done some work on this. And where are we going to be between 2015 and 2040 in terms of mobility? And we're going to be moving away from individuals owning cars, because within 3 or 4 years, yes, electrification, electric vehicles are very, very important as a first step, but they're not the end point. The end point is autonomous vehicles, because after all, we only drive and about an hour a day on average, and spend a lot of that time in traffic jams. So if you could reduce the number of cars by saying you've got a 24/7 autonomous vehicle available to you at reasonable cost, you buy a bundle, like you buy a bundle with a smartphone, then you can have many fewer cars, maybe half as many cars, and you're going to have cleaner roads, you're going to have less pollution and so on and so forth, all these benefits, but much less business in that sense for the chemical industry, because electric vehicles themselves have only about 20 moving parts compared to 2,000 in gasoline or diesel cars. And so that means that you're going to have a major change in demand. That's a challenge, also an opportunity, because if you have a lot of autonomous vehicles and they're much safer and you've got special routes for them, just as you do with carpools and so on today, then you won't need so much steel. You can use more plastic. So there's challenges and opportunities here, which we have to think about. And of course, there is the major final challenge of net zero. The International Energy Agency saying we don't need to invest more in fossil fuels now. We're fine as we are, But we do need to move to renewables and put a lot more energy into developing those sources of supply, which, as I said, will be good news for us in the chemical industry in the transition. And of course, we do need to move towards recycling, because the brand owners are very clearly saying, and this is the New Plastics Economy and Ellen MacArthur Foundation, that we can't go on throwing away plastic. A, because of the waste problem, the consumer just won't accept it anymore, and the damage in the seas and everywhere else. But B, because you can't release all that carbon back into the atmosphere. You've got to keep renewing the carbon. And so that's where the plastics industry has a tremendous future. I think it's going to see enormous growth. But growth isn't going to be in virgin plastic anymore. It's going to be in renewable plastic, in recycling. And that's going to create a number of major new opportunities for us. So I'm very optimistic about the next few years. I think we've got some very good opportunities ahead of us, but there's no doubt that it's very difficult, which is why we've introduced these challenge workshops for our clients. So, there are a lot of things happening at once in the landscape as well as down the silos. And trying to understand those, I think, is going to be key for the future. So I hope we have a very successful conference, as we always do, and exchange lots of ideas, and that next time we can all be together again. Thank you.